Tonight we dive into the harsh, the unclear, and the difficult parts of a sickness that happened not long ago, but during our own time. Forget the movie versions, the simple timelines, and the stories of brave discoveries. Living through it, honestly, was tiring. So before you settle in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I create here. Also, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's watching from different places around the world. Turn off your notifications, take a slow breath, and let's start. In the spring of 1981, a quiet worry began to spread through the doctor's offices of Los Angeles. It wasn't a sudden alarm, but a slow, growing understanding. The kind that appears at the edge of a doctor's view before becoming sharp and scary. At the UCLA Medical Center, a specialist named Michael Gottlieb was treating a group of young men, patients who should have been at their strongest and healthiest. They were energetic, smart, and by all past checks, well. Yet they came to his office with a strange and frightening mix of symptoms. Constant fevers that stuck to them like wet cloth, serious weight loss that made their faces look hollow, and a dry, never-ending cough. When he ordered chest x-rays, the pictures that returned were eerie, showing lungs filled with an infection that shouldn't have been there. It was pneumocystis pneumonia, or PCP, an unusual fungal infection previously only found in cancer patients receiving chemotherapy or in transplant patients whose immune systems had been purposely destroyed with chemicals to stop organ rejection. These young men, however, had no such background. Their immune systems were simply failing, breaking down from inside for no reason anyone could figure out. Over just 6 months, he treated 5 such cases. 5 young, previously healthy gay men, all mysteriously becoming sick from an illness meant for the most seriously ill. It was statistically impossible, a medical mystery wrapped in sadness. At the same time, 3,000 miles away in the busy, crowded clinics of New York City, another piece of the mystery was appearing. Though nobody yet understood, it was part of the same terrible picture. Skin doctors and cancer specialists, especially Alvin Friedman Keene at NYU, started noticing an aggressive, fast-growing form of a cancer so unusual it was thought of as a medical oddity. It was called Kaposi's sarcoma. The textbook description of KS was a slow-growing, almost harmless disease that showed up as 1 or 2 purple-brown spots on the lower legs of older men from Mediterranean or Eastern European Jewish backgrounds. It was a cancer you lived with, not one that killed you. But this was different. This wasn't the disease from the textbooks. On the bodies of young gay men in Greenwich Village and Chelsea, the spots were showing up everywhere, on their faces, inside their mouths, on their chests, and most frighteningly, spreading to their inside organs with terrible speed. What was once a small note in cancer books was now a wildfire, destroying its victims in just months. A 29-year-old with spots in his lungs, a 35-year-old with tumors invading his lymph nodes. It was as if their bodies had forgotten the basic rules of protecting themselves. In the quiet, air-conditioned offices of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, disease investigators, the medical detectives of public health, started receiving these strange reports. 2 groups of odd infections in 2 different cities, appearing unconnected, but sharing one common link. The patients were all gay men. On June 5, 1981, the CDC published a short, plain, deeply important article in its weekly newsletter, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, or MMWR. It was titled Pneumocystis Pneumonia, Los Angeles. It described Gottlieb's 5 patients in technical language, noting their homosexuality and their shared immune failure without drama or worry. It was a bulletin, a marker planted in the ground of medical history, showing the spot where the plague of the 20th century first officially appeared. 1 month later, on July 3rd, a second MMWR report followed, this time recording the Kaposi's sarcoma cases in New York and California, noting 26 men had been diagnosed in the past 30 months, and again pointing out that all were gay. The press started picking up the story, giving it a name that would stick in people's minds with cruel staying power. The gay cancer, for the men living in the lively, newly free gay neighborhoods of San Francisco's Castro district or New York's West Village. The news came down not through medical journals, but through whispers, rumors, and terrifying first-hand stories. A friend would get a strange purple mark on his arm. Another would suddenly be hospitalized with a fever that wouldn't stop. Men who'd been dancing at the Saint or the Trocadero just weeks before were now thin shadows. their futures wiped out by an invisible killer. The early theories came from panic and confusion. Was it the poppers, the amyl nitrite inhalants used as a muscle relaxer and sexual aid? Was it something in the water systems of the bathhouses? Was it a new changed form of an old sexually transmitted disease, a supersyphilis? The fear was real, a cold fog that settled over the dance floors and the brunch places. But beneath the fear was a growing sense of dread, the feeling of being hunted, of being picked out by a sickness that the rest of the world seemed happy to ignore. The first response from the medical and political systems was one of careful watching. It was a curiosity, a small problem affecting a marginalized group. It was their problem. And so, in the hot summer of 1981, the body count started to rise quietly, almost invisibly, as a generation of young men began to fight a battle against their own bodies, with no name for their enemy and no help in sight. The process of finding a name for this new, terrifying thing was not a simple act of medical naming. It was a battlefield of science, politics, and deep social hatred. In the earliest days, as the case numbers grew from dozens to hundreds, the one common factor remained constant. The vast majority of those affected were gay men. And so, in the hallways of the CDC and in the headlines of medical journals, a working title appeared, a label of convenience that would prove to be both scientifically narrow and catastrophically damaging. They called it GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. The name seemed at first to make a sad sort of sense. It described what was being seen on the ground in New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. But language is never neutral. A name doesn't just describe, it defines. And the definition suggested by GRID was that this was a disease naturally linked to homosexuality itself, a kind of biological punishment for a lifestyle. It created a barrier in the public imagination, a comfortable distance for the straight majority. It wasn't their disease, and it couldn't touch them. It was a gay plague. This term, GRID, fueled a storm of anti-gay talk that was already building in the conservative political climate of the early 1980s, providing a seemingly scientific reason for prejudice, allowing figures like Jerry Falwell and his moral majority to frame the epidemic as divine punishment. The disease wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a moral one, and its victims were not seen as patients deserving of care, but as sinners getting what they deserved. This framing had a terrible practical effect. It cut off federal funding for research, as politicians were afraid to be seen spending taxpayer money on a gay disease. It created an atmosphere of terror and shame within gay communities, where a diagnosis was not only a death sentence, but a mark of public shame. And it made it nearly impossible to sound a broader public health alarm, because the very name of the illness suggested a containment that simply didn't exist. But reality, as it often does, refused to fit into the neat, prejudice boxes that had been built for it. The disease was not so choosy. Soon, confusing cases began to appear, exceptions that destroyed the GRID theory. In New York, doctors reported the disease in straight drug users, both male and female, who were sharing dirty needles. Then came reports from the Haitian community, both in Haiti and among recent immigrants in Miami. They were not gay, they were not IV drug users, but they were dying of the same infections, the same immune collapse. The medical system, struggling to understand this, briefly and awkwardly created the term the 4H disease, referring to the four main at-risk groups identified so far: homosexuals, heroin users, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. It was another clumsy, damaging label, lumping desperate communities together under a flag of sickness. The most heartbreaking and scientifically clear evidence against GRID, however, came from the nation's blood banks. A 20-month-old baby in California who had received multiple blood transfusions for a heart condition was diagnosed with the telltale immune failure. He had no other risk factors. The only possible way was the blood he'd received from a donor who later died of the mysterious illness. Then a group of cases appeared among hemophiliacs, men and boys whose genetic condition required them to receive regular injections of a blood-clotting protein called Factor VIII. This healing concentrate was made by pooling plasma from thousands of different donors. A single infected donor could contaminate an entire batch, which was then sent across the country. The evidence was clear. The disease was not related to being gay. It was caused by an infectious agent, a germ that was being passed through body fluids, through sexual contact, through shared needles, and most terrifyingly, through the national blood supply. This new reality forced a change. In the summer of 1982, public health officials held a critical meeting in Washington, D.C. The name GRID was no longer just insulting. It was dangerously wrong. It was hiding the true nature of the threat and blocking the public health response. A new name was needed, one that was medical, descriptive, and neutral. It had to reflect the mechanism of the disease, not the perceived morality of its victims. After much debate, they settled on a new term, formally adopting it on July 27, 1982. They would call it Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS. Each word was chosen with careful precision. Acquired. This was not a genetic or birth condition. It was something one got after birth. Immune deficiency. This accurately described the core of the problem, the catastrophic failure of the body's immune system. And syndrome. This was a crucial admission of not knowing. A syndrome is a collection of symptoms and diseases that occur together, but whose underlying cause is not yet known. At that point in mid-1982, scientists had not yet isolated the virus responsible. They were still fighting a ghost. The renaming was a turning point. It was an attempt to take the story away from moral panic and place it firmly in the realm of disease tracking and virus study. It was a declaration that this was a human disease, not the affliction of a specific group. But the ghost of GRID would linger for years, its legacy of stigma and fear poisoning the well of public compassion and delaying a truly unified, effective response to the growing crisis. The enemy finally had a proper name, but the war was only just beginning. The new name AIDS was a medical necessity born from the chilling understanding that the disease was not confined to any single community. It was in the blood. This discovery transformed the epidemic from a contained, if tragic, crisis in marginalized groups into a universal terror that threatened the very heart of modern medicine. The circulation system of the nation was effectively contaminated, and the blood banking system, a pillar of 20th century healthcare built on giving and trust, was about to become an unwitting agent of death on a massive scale. The panic didn't erupt all at once, but began with a series of specific, horrifying discoveries that exposed a catastrophic weakness. The first and most deeply tragic victims of this new route were the nation's hemophiliacs. For centuries, hemophilia had been a devastating diagnosis. A simple cut could be life-threatening, and internal bleeding was a constant, painful danger. But by the late 1970s, a medical miracle had arrived in the form of factor VIII concentrate. This clotting factor, essential for individuals with hemophilia A, was extracted from human plasma. To create a cost-effective, stable supply, pharmaceutical companies would pool the plasma from thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of individual donors to create a single batch of concentrate. A hemophiliac could inject this product at home, allowing them to live a nearly normal life. It was a triumph of medical logistics and technology. But this very system of pooling and concentration created a perfect multiplying mechanism for a blood-borne germ. If just one donor in a pool of 10,000 was infected with the still unidentified virus, the entire multi-million-dollar batch of factor VIII was contaminated. And because the donors were often paid, the plasma collection centers attracted individuals from high-risk populations, including IV drug users desperate for cash. In late 1982, the CDC reported the first cases of PCP in 3 hemophiliacs. They were not gay. They did not use IV drugs. Their only shared risk was their reliance on factor VIII. The implications were staggering. The miracle treatment that had given them freedom was now poisoning them. The very medicine that kept them alive was now a ticking time bomb, delivering a fatal, incurable disease directly into their veins. The scale of the coming disaster was immense. There were roughly 20,000 hemophiliacs in the United States, and nearly all of them who relied on concentrate were about to be exposed. It was a public health catastrophe of almost unimaginable size, a silent, slow-motion mass poisoning event unfolding within the sterile packaging of a life-saving drug. The community was destroyed. Young boys who had looked forward to a full life were suddenly facing certain death. Families who had celebrated the end of one medical nightmare were thrown into a new, far darker one. As the crisis among hemophiliacs became clear, a broader, more widespread fear began to grip the general public. If the virus was in the plasma concentrates, it was in the general blood supply as well. Every routine surgery, every emergency C-section, every car accident victim who needed a transfusion was now at risk. The hospital, once a place of healing, now held a hidden danger. The blood bag hanging by a patient's bedside, a symbol of life-giving care, could be a vessel of plague. This fear was not abstract. By early 1983, cases were being confirmed in transfusion recipients from all walks of life. Elderly patients who had undergone hip replacements, middle-aged women who had surgery, and most heartbreakingly, newborn babies who had received transfusions in neonatal intensive care units. The media seized on these stories, and the narrative of a gay plague was violently shattered. AIDS was everyone's problem now. The response from the institutions responsible for the safety of the blood supply, a powerful group of for-profit pharmaceutical companies, non-profit blood banks like the Red Cross, and federal regulators like the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, was tragically slow and marked by a fatal calculation of risk, liability, and revenue. As early as January 1983, the CDC held a tense meeting with representatives from these groups. The CDC's own scientists, like Dr. Don Francis, argued strongly for immediate action. They recommended that blood banks begin screening donors by asking them direct questions about their sexual history and drug use, and that all blood products should be treated with heat to kill the virus, a method already known to work for destroying other viruses like hepatitis B. The blood industry pushed back hard. They argued that such screening questions would be an invasion of privacy and would scare away donors, leading to critical blood shortages. They claimed the cost of putting in place new testing and heat-treating procedures was too high. They questioned the CDC's data, suggesting the link between blood and AIDS was still unproven, merely a connection. Behind the official arguments was a deep-seated fear of liability. To admit the blood supply was contaminated was to open themselves up to a flood of lawsuits that could bankrupt them. And so they chose to wait. They chose to study the problem further. The official position was one of deliberate, slow observation. The virus, of course, was in a great hurry. For more than 2 years, while committees met and memos were exchanged, the American blood supply remained largely unscreened. During that fatal period, thousands more people, including an estimated half of all hemophiliacs in the country, were infected. Public panic grew. People scheduled for optional surgeries began to store their own blood in advance, a process known as autologous donation. Others simply refused necessary medical procedures. The trust between the public and the medical system was breaking. The very act of giving blood, once a civic duty, became filled with anxiety. It wasn't until 1985, after the causative virus HIV had been clearly identified, and a reliable antibody test was developed, that mandatory screening of the entire US blood supply was finally put in place. It was a landmark achievement in public health, a technological solution that would eventually make the blood supply incredibly safe. But it came too late. The damage had been done. The blood system, which had been corrupted by a combination of a new, sneaky virus and old-fashioned institutional slowness, had failed in its most sacred duty. It had taken a promise of life and, for thousands of innocent victims, delivered a sentence of death in the quiet, sterile hallways of the Pasteur Institute in Paris. A different kind of war was being waged. It was not a war of armies, but of microscopes and petri dishes, of patience and careful observation. The year was 1983. In a fourth-floor laboratory, a small dedicated team led by a virologist named Luc Montagnier was leaning in close, trying to hear a whisper from the blood. They had received a precious and terrible gift. A small piece of a lymph node taken from a 33-year-old patient named Frédéric Brugière. His body was a battleground for the new disease, and within this tiny piece of tissue, they hoped to find the enemy commander. The work was delicate, almost magical. Montagnier's colleague, the brilliant and careful Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, took the lead. She and her team gently encouraged the cells from the lymph node to grow in a culture, feeding them a nutrient mixture and a special growth factor. They were growing a killer in order to see its face. The theory held by a few forward-thinking scientists was that the agent behind this immune collapse was a retrovirus, a strange and clever type of virus that writes its own genetic code into the DNA of its host. The calling card of a retrovirus is an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. Finding its activity would be like finding a footprint at a crime scene. Day after day, they watched the cultures, waiting. Then, after 2 painful weeks, they saw it. A spike in reverse transcriptase activity. The footprint was there. Under the powerful view of an electron microscope, they finally saw the culprit. Tiny, round particles, budding from the surface of an infected cell. It was a virus, elegant and deadly, and they gave it a working name: lymphadenopathy-associated virus, or LAV, they had isolated the enemy. In May of 1983, they published their findings in the journal Science. It was a huge achievement, a signal sent up in the dark. But across the Atlantic, the signal was met with a complicated mixture of interest and professional doubt, particularly from one man. Dr. Robert Gallo at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, was a giant of virology. He was brilliant, aggressive, and supremely self-confident. He had discovered the first human retroviruses, HTLV-I and HTLV-2, and he was convinced that the agent causing AIDS was simply another member of this family. Likely HTLV-3, Gallo's lab was a powerhouse, larger, better funded, and more famous than the quiet group in Paris. When he heard of Montagnier's discovery, he was not entirely convinced. To him, the French team was competent, but they were not in his league. A professional correspondence began, a delicate dance of scientific courtesy layered over simmering competition. Montagnier sent Gallo's lab a sample of LAV, as was customary for confirmation and further study. Here the story becomes a dense fog of disputed facts and wounded pride, a tale told differently depending on whether you are standing in Paris or Bethesda. Gallo's lab began to culture the virus. Months passed. Then, in the spring of 1984, the fog lifted with a thunderclap. U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Margaret Heckler called a dramatic press conference in Washington, D.C., standing beside a triumphant Robert Gallo. She announced to the world that an American scientist had discovered the probable cause of AIDS. The virus, Gallo declared, was a new retrovirus he had named HTLV-3. He also announced, with breathtaking confidence, that a blood test was coming soon and a vaccine would be ready for testing in 2 years. The world celebrated. America had found the answer. But back in Paris there was shock, then a growing, sickening sense of betrayal. The virus that Gallo was presenting as his own discovery, HTLV-3, looked identical to their LAV. When the genetic sequences were eventually compared, the truth was undeniable. The virus from Gallo's lab was not merely similar to the one Montagnier's team had sent him. It was the very same virus, or at best, a contaminant from that sample that had overgrown his own cultures. An ugly public fight erupted. It was a bitter war for credit, for patents on the blood test worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and for the Nobel Prize that was surely to come. The French accused Gallo of intellectual theft. Gallo and his supporters claimed it was simultaneous independent discovery, or perhaps an accidental contamination that was ultimately irrelevant because his lab had been the one to prove the virus definitively caused AIDS. The fight raged for years, escalating to the highest levels of government. It took a summit between President Ronald Reagan and French Prime Minister Jacques Chirac in 1987 to broker a political truce, a joint statement declaring that both teams had co-discovered the virus. They would share the patent royalties, but the scientific wound festered. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in the murky middle, a story of ambition, miscommunication, and perhaps a tragic lab accident. But the end result of this bitter race, for all its human messiness, was a key that turned a mighty lock. Having a name for the virus, whether you called it LAV, HTLV-3, or its final neutral designation, human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, was everything. It allowed for the development of that blood test, a tool that could finally track the silent spread of the epidemic. It allowed the world's blood supply to be secured, and it gave science a specific, tangible target to attack. The hunt for a treatment could now begin in earnest. But as the scientists argued over who deserved the glory, the virus they had unmasked was continuing its silent, relentless work in a world where the people in power had chosen, for a time, to look away. While the laboratories in Paris and Bethesda hummed with the urgency of discovery, the grand white buildings of Washington, D.C. were filled with a profound and deliberate silence. In the White House, President Ronald Reagan presided over an administration defined by a sunny, optimistic vision of morning in America. It was a vision built on conservative values, a strong military, and a belief in traditional morality. And in this bright morning light, there was simply no room for the dark, messy reality of a plague that was devastating a community the administration preferred to ignore. For the first 4 years of the epidemic, as the death toll climbed from a few dozen to several thousand, the President of the United States did not publicly say the word AIDS. It was not an oversight, it was a policy. His administration was deeply influenced by the growing power of the religious right, figures like Jerry Falwell of the Moral Majority, who framed the disease not as a public health crisis but as a divine reckoning. It was, in their telling, a punishment for sin, a gay plague that was cleansing society of moral degenerates. This narrative, poisonous and widespread, provided a powerful political justification for inaction. To spend government money or presidential attention on AIDS would be to legitimize a lifestyle that Reagan's political base condemned. His influential communications director, Pat Buchanan, argued internally that AIDS was nature's revenge on gay men. With such attitudes shaping policy, compassion was off the table. The silence from the top echoed down through every level of government. The Centers for Disease Control, the nation's frontline defense against disease, was starved for resources. In 1982, CDC scientists requested nearly $9 million for AIDS research and surveillance. The Reagan administration slashed their budget request by more than half. Scientists at the National Institutes of Health, the very institution where Robert Gallo was conducting his research, had to fight for every dollar, scraping together funds from other projects to study this new, terrifying illness. The public health infrastructure of the most powerful nation on earth was being systematically weakened at the precise moment it was needed most. The contempt was not always silent. Sometimes it showed itself in moments of shocking public cruelty. At the White House press briefings, Reagan's press secretary, Larry Speakes, turned the epidemic into a running joke. When a reporter, Lester Kinsolving, first asked about the gay plague in 1982, Speakes responded with a smirk. "I don't have it. Do you?" The press corps erupted in laughter. Over the next 2 years, Kinsolving would repeatedly try to ask about the administration's response to the growing crisis. Each time he was met with anti-gay jokes and mocking laughter from Speakes and the other journalists in the room. These were not off-the-cuff remarks. They were a performance of contempt, a clear signal that the lives of gay men were not a subject of serious concern for the Reagan White House. The transcripts of those briefings are chilling documents, records of a government amusing itself while its citizens died. This official silence and private contempt had devastating real-world consequences. With no national leadership, there was no coordinated public health education campaign. In the vacuum of information, fear and misinformation flourished. People were fired from their jobs merely on the suspicion that they were gay or had the virus. Children with AIDS, like the young Ryan White in Indiana, were banned from attending school. Landlords evicted tenants. Dentists refused to treat patients. Families disowned their own sons. The silence from Washington was not just a failure to act. It was a form of permission. It told the country that this discrimination, this cruelty, was acceptable. It validated the worst impulses of a frightened and prejudiced public. It wasn't until September 17, 1985, after more than 12,000 Americans had already died, that President Reagan finally said the word AIDS in public, in response to a reporter's question. His first major speech on the epidemic would not come until 1987, by which time the death toll had surpassed 25,000 tonnes. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership, a moral and political stain. The early years of the epidemic were a perfect storm. A new, mysterious virus attacking a marginalized community at a moment when the government was uniquely hostile to that community's existence. The official policy was not malice exactly. It was something colder, more indifferent. It was the simple, brutal calculation that these were not lives that mattered, that their deaths were not a national tragedy, but a quiet, convenient solution to a problem that polite society preferred not to discuss. The government's silence had effectively sentenced thousands of its own people to death through neglect. But silence, when held for too long, can create a pressure that becomes unbearable. And in the streets of New York, that pressure was about to find its voice in a roar of incandescent rage. The rage had been simmering for years, a low boil of grief and frustration. It lived in the hearts of men who had attended more funerals than birthday parties, who watched their friends and lovers wither away into skeletal strangers. It was nurtured by the indignity of a government that made jokes about their extinction and a medical establishment that treated them like outcasts. The existing gay organizations, like the Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, were doing heroic work, providing services, comfort, and care to the dying. They ran buddy programs and hotlines. They held people's hands. But for some, this was not enough. Care and comfort were essential, but they would not stop the dying. For that, you needed a fight. You needed a war. The man who would sound the call to arms was a writer named Larry Kramer. He was brilliant, abrasive, and completely incapable of polite silence. He was a prophet of anger. In March 1983, his essay 1112 and Counting, published in the New York Native, was a literary hand grenade tossed into the complacency of the gay community itself, a searing accusation of its political passivity in the face of annihilation. He had co-founded GMHC, but left in frustration, believing its approach was too timid, too apologetic. He wanted confrontation. He wanted noise. On March 10, 1987, Kramer was invited to speak at the Lesbian and Gay Community Services Center in New York. The room was packed. He did not offer words of comfort. He offered a challenge, a threat, a prophecy. He paced the stage, a vessel of pure, focused fury. "If my speech tonight doesn't scare the shit out of you, we're in real trouble," he began. He laid out the terrifying numbers, the political neglect, the pharmaceutical greed. He ended with a question that hung in the air like a death sentence. "We are in the middle of a fucking plague, and you behave like you're going to a tea party. Do we want to start a new organization devoted solely to political action?" 2 days later, about 300 people packed into that same room, ready to answer his question. This was the birth of the AIDS Coalition to unleash power. ACT UP. From its very first moments, ACT UP was different. It was not a service organization. It was a political army. It was non-hierarchical, democratic, and breathtakingly efficient. Anyone who showed up to the weekly Monday night meetings was a member. Decisions were made by consensus in sprawling, chaotic, and intensely passionate debates that could last for hours. There were committees for everything: treatment and data, media, action, outreach. It was a self-organizing organism fueled by desperation and intelligence. They understood instinctively that in modern America, power flowed from two sources: money and media. And they resolved to attack both. They also understood the power of symbols. They needed a symbol, a banner for their new war. A group of artists within ACT UP formed a collective called Grand Fury. They took the pink triangle, the symbol used to identify homosexuals in Nazi concentration camps, but they inverted it, pointing it up, a sign of defiance and resurrection. They placed it on a stark black background beneath two simple, powerful words: silence, death. It was a masterpiece of graphic design and political messaging. It was not a request, it was an equation. It stated a fact: your silence, the government's silence, the media's silence, was killing them. The poster began appearing on walls and lampposts all over New York City, a ghostly and everywhere reminder of the stakes. Their tactics were as brilliant as their branding. They embraced non-violent civil disobedience, learning from the playbooks of the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests of the 60s. But they added a theatrical, media-savvy flair all their own. They called their protests zaps. They were designed to be disruptive, photogenic, and impossible to ignore. Their first major action took place on March 24, 1987, less than 2 weeks after their founding. They descended on Wall Street, the symbolic heart of American capitalism. Their target was the pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome, the manufacturer of the only approved AIDS drug at the time, AZT. The company had priced the drug at an astonishing $10,000 per year per patient, a death sentence for anyone without excellent insurance. Hundreds of protesters flooded the streets, chanting "ACT UP! Fight back! Fight AIDS!" They unfurled banners. They staged a die-in, dozens of people lying down in the middle of the street, blocking traffic, creating a visual representation of the daily death toll. 17 people were arrested, and it was all on the evening news. They had hijacked the media narrative. For the first time, the anger of people with AIDS was a lead story. This was just the beginning. The actions grew larger, more ambitious, more daring. On October 11, 1988, ACT UP staged its most audacious protest yet: seize control of the FDA. For months, the Treatment and Data Committee, a group of self-taught scientific experts, had researched the Food and Drug Administration's slow, bureaucratic drug approval process. Patients were dying while potentially life-saving experimental drugs were tied up in years of clinical trials. The activists didn't just want to shout at the FDA, they wanted to tell them how to do their job better. The action was a logistical marvel. Over 1,000 activists from chapters across the country converged on the FDA headquarters in Rockville, Maryland. They came prepared. They had maps of the building, schedules of employee arrivals, They blocked every entrance, wearing lab coats splattered with fake blood. They carried signs not with vague slogans, but with highly specific policy demands. Release experimental drugs, shorten the drug approval process. They had studied the science, and they came with a plan. They shut the agency down for the entire day. The action was so effective, so well researched, and so undeniably morally right that it worked. It forced the FDA to listen. Within a few years, the agency had implemented a parallel track system, allowing desperately ill patients access to experimental drugs outside of formal clinical trials, a direct result of the pressure applied by ACT UP. They had literally changed the way medicine was tested and approved in the United States. They had done it not with bombs or bullets, but with signs, chance, intelligence, and the sheer unyielding power of their presence. They were a community that had been told to die quietly in the dark. Instead, they had stood up in the full glare of the world's attention and roared. In the quiet hum of laboratories, where glass beakers held sterile liquids and hope was measured in micrograms, a ghost was waiting, a molecule synthesized 2 decades earlier and then abandoned. It had been born in 1964, the creation of a scientist named Jerome Horwitz, who was searching for a weapon against cancer. He had designed it to be a saboteur, a tiny defective building block that would trick cancer cells into incorporating it into their DNA, thereby stopping the chain of replication. A molecular dead end, but it had failed against the leukemia cells it was tested on in mice. It proved utterly useless, and so the compound, azidithimidine, was shelved, a forgotten footnote in a dusty chemical catalogue, codenamed Compound S. For 20 years it sat, an answer waiting for a question. By the mid-1980s, the question was screaming from hospital wards and hospice beds. The human immunodeficiency virus was a retrovirus, a peculiar and sneaky kind of biological machine. Unlike most life, which copies its genetic code from DNA to RNA, a retrovirus works backwards. It carries its instructions as RNA, and using a special enzyme called reverse transcriptase, it rewrites that code into the DNA of the very cell it has invaded. It turns the host into the factory for its own replication. To stop HIV, you had to stop that enzyme. You had to break the machine. And so, researchers at the pharmaceutical company Burroughs Wellcome, a firm with deep experience in antiviral compounds, began a frantic search. They dusted off old shelves. They tested everything, and they found Compound S. Suddenly, the failed cancer drug had a new purpose. The same mechanism that was meant to trick a cancer cell could, in theory, trick the reverse transcriptase enzyme. AZT, as it was now known, looked almost identical to thymidine, one of the 4 crucial building blocks of DNA. The enzyme would grab it, try to plug it into the new strand of viral DNA it was building inside a T-cell, and then stop. The chain would be terminated. The saboteur would finally do its job. In the laboratory, it worked with brutal efficiency. The pressure to move from the petri dish to the patient was immense. In 1986, the National Institutes of Health, under the watchful eye of Dr. Anthony Fauci, began a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, the gold standard of medical research. 282 patients, all with advanced AIDS, were enrolled. Half would receive a small white pill containing AZT. The other half would receive an identical-looking sugar pill. Neither the patients nor the doctors would know who was getting what. It was a cold, clinical, and necessary calculation. But for the people in the trial, it was a terrifying gamble. They were dying, and their odds of receiving the only potential lifeline were exactly 50%. The results came with shocking speed. After just a few months, the Independent Monitoring Board looked at the data and saw something astonishing. In the placebo group, 19 people had died. In the AZT group, only 1 had. The difference was so stark, so statistically undeniable, that it was deemed unethical to continue. The trial was halted early in September 1986, and everyone, including the placebo group, was offered the drug. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. Science had found a weapon. A tiny crack of light had appeared in the suffocating darkness. On March 20th, 1987, the US Food and Drug Administration, moving at a speed that was then and remains now almost unheard of, gave its official approval. Azidithimidine, marketed under the brand name Retrovir, became the first approved treatment for AIDS. The announcement felt like the end of a war. For so many, it was merely the beginning of a different one. The victory was double-edged, a salvation wrapped in poison. AZT was a brutally toxic drug. It didn't just stop the virus from replicating. Its sabotage was not nearly so precise. It also damaged the machinery of the body's own cells, particularly those that divided rapidly. It attacked the bone marrow, the very factory of the blood. Patients on AZT often developed severe, debilitating anemia. They became weak, breathless, their bodies starved of oxygen. They required frequent, exhausting blood transfusions, trading the virus for a life tethered to an IV drip. They suffered from crippling nausea, intense headaches, and muscle wasting. The drug that was saving their lives was also making every moment of that life a misery. It was a Faustian bargain, made every 6 hours with a rattling of pills in a plastic bottle. And then there was the price. Burroughs' Welcome, having resurrected a publicly funded, forgotten compound, set the cost at roughly $10,000 per patient per year. In mid-1987, this was an astronomical sum, the most expensive prescription drug in history. It placed the first glimmer of hope behind an impenetrable paywall. For those with good insurance, it was a struggle. For those without, the vast majority of the sick, it was a death sentence pronounced not by a virus, but by an accountant. The activists who had once chained themselves to the White House gates now had a new target. The slogan "Silence Hum Death" was joined by signs that read, "Pills cost pennies. Greed costs lives." ACT UP descended on Wall Street, infiltrating the New York Stock Exchange to protest the shameless profiteering of Burroughs' Welcome. They understood the grim reality. A cure that is unaffordable is not a cure at all. For the patients, the choice was agonizing. Do you endure the poison for a little more time? Do you bankrupt your family for a chance to see another spring? Many discovered the drug only worked for a year or two before the wily virus mutated, developing resistance and rendering the treatment useless. It was a stopgap, a temporary reprieve, a way to buy time. But time for what? For many, the answer was simply time to die with a little more dignity, a little more slowly. The little white pill was not a silver bullet. It was a shield, but a shield that was heavy, corrosive, and certain to fail. While scientists in sterile labs chased molecules and corporations calculated profit margins, another kind of response was being stitched together. It grew not from data and trials, but from grief and memory. It was a response made of fabric and thread, of love and rage. For everybody that the little white pill could not save, a story needed to be told. A life needed to be marked. The idea began, as so many things did in this story, in San Francisco. In November of 1985, Cleve Jones, a longtime activist and a friend of Harvey Milk, was helping to organize the annual Candlelight March to remember Milk and Mayor George Moscone, who'd been assassinated 7 years earlier. As the marchers prepared to walk through the city, he handed them placards and magic markers, asking them to write down the names of friends and loved ones they had lost to the growing epidemic. At the end of the march, as people stood in the cold night air, they began taping these placards to the wall of the old federal building. It formed a patchwork of names, a paper quilt. Standing back and looking at the hundreds of names under the flickering candlelight, Jones was struck by the sight. It looked, he thought, like a quilt. A quilt. The word itself conjured images of warmth, of community, of home, of generations of women sitting together, stitching scraps of old cloth, a piece of a wedding dress, a patch from a baby's blanket, a square from a favorite flannel shirt, into a single unified whole. A quilt tells a story. It preserves memory in its very fibers. Jones realized that a quilt of fabric, not paper, could be the perfect memorial. A memorial that could be touched, held. A memorial that could show the world the scale of the loss in a way that numbers on a page never could. A memorial for a community that had no access to traditional forms of grieving. They were denied funerals by terrified families, shunned by churches, refused burial by cemeteries. They needed their own way to say goodbye. In 1987, Jones, along with a small group of friends, formally launched the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. They rented a storefront on Market Street and sent out a simple call to action. They asked people to create a 3-foot by 6-foot fabric panel the size of a human grave to commemorate the life of someone who had died of AIDS. The instructions were simple, but the emotional task was monumental. All across the country, in living rooms and church basements, in community centers and art studios, people began to sew. They were not, for the most part, master craftspeople. They were mothers and fathers, lovers and friends, siblings and colleagues. They pulled out old sewing machines that hadn't been used in years. They gathered materials that held meaning. A panel for a dancer was made from his favorite silk costumes. A panel for a soldier was pieced together from his military uniforms, his merit badges sewn carefully onto the fabric. A panel for a child included his favorite teddy bear, its fuzzy body stitched right into the center. They used sequins, leather, lace, denim, paint, and photographs. They sewed on wedding rings, car keys, faded letters, and locks of hair. Each panel was a biography in miniature, a concentration of a life. One read simply, "My brother." Another, for a man named Ron, was a brilliant blue sky filled with puffy white clouds, a testament to his love of flying, with the words, "Free at last." There were panels of breathtaking artistry and panels of heartbreaking simplicity. What mattered was not the skill, but the act. The slow meditative process of pushing a needle through cloth became a ritual of grieving. Every stitch was a memory, every knot was a refusal to forget. The storefront in San Francisco was soon overwhelmed. Panels arrived every day in the mail, folded carefully in cardboard boxes. Volunteers, who became the project's lifeblood, would unpack them. They would read the letters that often accompanied the panels, letters filled with stories of love, humor, and unimaginable pain. Then they would lay the new panel on the floor, and a small group would gather around it. Someone would read the name aloud, and for a moment in that quiet, dusty workshop, a person who had been reduced to a statistic was made whole again. He was Ron. He was someone's brother. He was loved. The logistics of the project were staggering. The individual panels were stitched together into larger 12-foot by 12-foot blocks, each containing 8 panels. These blocks were designed to be portable so the quilt could travel, becoming a nomadic memorial, a tool for education and activism. Its first destination was Washington, D.C., on October 11, 1987, for the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. The quilt was unfolded for the first time on the National Mall. The scale of it was breathtaking. 1,120 individual panels were laid out, covering a space larger than a football field. It was a vast, colorful, silent city of the dead, laid out on the doorstep of a White House that refused to even speak the name of the disease. Volunteers walked the paths between the blocks, holding microphones, reading the names aloud one by one. The reading of the names began in the morning and continued until dusk, a constant, somber recitation. For hours, the air was filled with this litany of loss: Robert, Michael, David, Jeffrey, Paul. People walked through the display in stunned silence, weeping openly. They knelt to touch the name of a friend, tracing the letters with their fingers. They saw panels for people they had known, and panels for thousands they had not, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that their private, isolated grief was part of a collective national tragedy. The quilt transformed the abstract number of the dead into an ocean of individual stories. It was folk art on an epic scale, but it was also a devastatingly effective political weapon. It was impossible to look at the quilt and see statistics. You saw sons, you saw lovers, you saw lives. It was an indictment, stitched in thread, of a government's apathy and a nation's fear. The quilt gave a name to every ghost, but the living still had to fight, and sometimes the most powerful weapon in that fight was not a protest sign, or a scientific paper, or even a vast memorial quilt. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was a single recognizable face, a face that America thought it knew. The first of these faces belonged to a boy from Kokomo, Indiana, with a gentle smile and glasses that seemed just a little too big for his face. His name was Ryan White. Ryan was a hemophiliac, born with a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. His life was dependent on regular injections of a clotting agent called Factor VIII, a miracle product derived from the pooled plasma of thousands of blood donors. In the early 80s, that miracle product became a route for death. The nation's blood supply was contaminated with HIV, and hemophiliacs who received the concentrate from so many different donors were extraordinarily vulnerable. In December of 1984, after a bout of pneumonia, 13-year-old Ryan White was diagnosed with AIDS. His doctors gave him 6 months to live. Ryan, however, did not die. He felt better. He felt well enough, in fact, to do what any 13-year-old wants to do, go back to school. But when he tried to return to Western Middle School in the fall of 1985, he was told he could not. The school superintendent, citing fear and ignorance among other parents and teachers, barred him from attending. It was a decision that plunged the small town of Kokomo into a storm of panic and prejudice. What followed was a brutal year-long legal battle. Ryan's mother, a fiercely protective woman named Jean Hale, refused to accept the ruling. She fought the school board in court, armed with the scientific consensus from the Centers for Disease Control that AIDS could not be transmitted through casual contact. The opposition was vicious. Tires on the family car were slashed. A bullet was fired through their living room window. At school, parents pulled their children out of classrooms, started their own alternative school, and held angry public meetings where the rhetoric was steeped in unscientific terror. Ryan's locker was vandalized with anti-gay slurs, even though he had contracted the virus from a blood product. In the eyes of many, the disease itself was a mark of moral failure, regardless of its origin. The story of the boy from Kokomo who just wanted to go to school became national news, and Ryan White became the unwilling face of AIDS-related discrimination. He was, in the language of the media, an innocent victim. It was a deeply problematic label, one that implicitly suggested there were guilty victims, but it was also a strategically powerful one. Ryan was not gay. He was not an intravenous drug user. He was a sick child. His quiet, dignified presence on television talk shows, where he spoke with a poise that belied his years, began to chip away at the monolithic stereotype of who got AIDS. He patiently explained his illness. He talked about his friends. He talked about his desire to be normal. He put a human face, a child's face, on the abstract hysteria. People who might have dismissed the plight of gay men in New York or San Francisco could not so easily dismiss the story of Ryan White. He forced a conversation in living rooms across Middle America when he finally won his legal battle and returned to school. 1,000 cameras were there to document it. He eventually had to leave Kokomo due to the relentless hostility, moving to the nearby town of Cicero, where he was welcomed with open arms. Ryan White lived 5 years longer than his doctors predicted. When he died in April of 1990, just a month before his high school graduation, flags were flown at half-mast, and the entire country mourned. 4 months later, the US Congress passed the Ryan White Care Act, a landmark piece of legislation that provided billions of dollars in funding for low-income and uninsured people with HIV/AIDS. The quiet boy who just wanted to go to school had changed. The law of the land. If Ryan White's face gently cracked the door of public perception, the next face blew it off its hinges. It was the face of a champion, a hero, a man who seemed to embody health, joy, and impossible vitality. It was the face of Irvin Magic Johnson. On November 7, 1991, the world of sports came to a sudden, screeching halt. The Los Angeles Lakers called an unexpected press conference. Rumors swirled. Had Magic been traded? Was he retiring because of an injury? No one was prepared for the truth. Magic Johnson, the superstar point guard with the magnetic, 1,000-watt smile, the 3-time NBA Most Valuable Player, the icon who had led the Showtime Lakers to 5 championships, walked to the podium and looked into the cameras. He took a deep breath, and then he said the words that sent a shockwave across the globe. "Because of the HIV virus that I have attained," he said calmly, "I will have to retire from the Lakers today." The silence in the room was absolute. It was followed by a gasp of collective disbelief. Magic Johnson, the athlete who seemed invincible, who played with such infectious joy. The man who was a revered hero, not just in black communities, but across all of America. The married heterosexual superstar. How was this possible? In that single moment, the entire landscape of the AIDS epidemic shifted. Magic Johnson's announcement did what a decade of activism, scientific reports, and public health campaigns had failed to do. It made AIDS real for everyone. It vaporized the comfortable fiction that this was a disease confined to marginalized groups, to gay men, to drug users, to the poor. If it could happen to Magic, a symbol of strength and success, a man at the absolute pinnacle of physical prowess, then it could happen to anyone. The impact was immediate and measurable. In the days and weeks that followed his announcement, public health hotlines that had received a few hundred calls a day were suddenly fielding tens of thousands. HIV testing centers were overwhelmed with people, many of them heterosexual men, who suddenly felt a personal sense of vulnerability. The conversation changed overnight. Johnson, by his own admission, had contracted the virus through unprotected heterosexual sex. His frankness forced a national dialogue about safe sex and personal responsibility that had been blocked for years by political and religious conservatism. Unlike Ryan White, Magic Johnson was not seen as a victim. He was seen as a warrior. He announced his retirement not as a defeat, but as a new mission. "I'm going to go on, and I'm going to beat it," he declared. "And I'm going to have fun." He immediately became a powerful advocate for AIDS education. He joined the National Commission on AIDS, spoke with President George H.W. Bush, and used his immense celebrity to raise awareness and fight stigma. He showed the world that a person with HIV was not a skeletal figure in a hospital bed, but could be a vibrant, strong, and productive human being. He was, quite simply, the most famous person on the planet to be living with the virus, and his continued health and public life provided a powerful new narrative: hope. He was the face of living with HIV, not just dying from it. Together, the boy from Indiana and the basketball legend from Los Angeles achieved something profound. They decoupled the virus from identity. They moved the story of AIDS out of the shadows and into the mainstream light. Ryan White's struggle showed the cruelty of fear. Magic Johnson's revelation showed the universality of risk. They were two profoundly different people, from two profoundly different worlds, whose stories intersected at the epicenter of a plague. They didn't discover a drug or stitch a quilt. They simply stood before the world and told their truth. And in doing so, they forced a nation to listen, and finally to begin to change its mind. The middle of the 90s felt like a long, exhausted sigh. The initial shock of the epidemic had long since hardened into a grim, exhausting routine of caregiving and loss. The early drugs, the monotherapies like AZT, had proven to be little more than brief delays, fleeting gestures against a virus that was terrifyingly adaptable. The virus would learn the drug's simple trick, sidestep it, and resume its methodical dismantling of the human immune system. Hope was a currency in desperately short supply. In the gay neighborhoods of New York, San Francisco, and London, the sound of sirens was the city's pulse, and the obituary pages of local papers were thick with the faces of young men. Hospices were full. Support groups were turning into bereavement groups. The activism of the late 80s and early 90s, so full of fire and righteous fury, had settled into a kind of weary endurance. They had won battles for dignity, for faster drug trials, for a seat at the table, but they were still losing the war, one body at a time. The fundamental biological reality remained unchanged. An HIV diagnosis was a death sentence, merely a question of how many months or years you had left to count. Then came Vancouver, July 1996, the 11th International AIDS Conference. These conferences were usually somber affairs, a place for scientists to present small data and for activists to criticize the slow pace of progress. But the air in Vancouver felt different. There were whispers in the hallways, a nervous energy, a current of rumor that felt too good to be true. Researchers had been working on a new class of drugs called protease inhibitors. Unlike the earlier drugs that tried to stop the virus from copying its genetic code into a cell, these new ones worked at the very end of the process. They were like a saboteur on an assembly line, preventing the final crucial step where new viral particles are cut and assembled, ready to burst forth and infect other cells. The strategy was no longer to throw a single wrench into the works. The new idea, championed by researchers like Dr. David Ho of the Aaron Diamond AIDS Research Center, was combination therapy, a cocktail. Hit the virus with 2, or better yet 3, different drugs at once, each targeting a different part of its life cycle. It was a coordinated assault. The virus, in its relentless process of mutation, might learn to evade one drug, but the statistical odds of it simultaneously developing resistance to 3 different mechanisms were astronomically low. When the data was presented in the vast, packed conference halls of Vancouver, the effect was electric. It wasn't just a slight improvement, it was a revolution. Study after study showed the same astonishing results. Patients on these new 3-drug regimens, which came to be known as highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART, saw the amount of virus in their blood plummet. It didn't just fall, it crashed, often to levels so low that standard tests could no longer detect it. Their T-cell counts, the measure of a healthy immune system, which had been in a freefall for years, suddenly stopped falling. Then, slowly, miraculously, they began to rise. The graphs on the projector screens showed lines moving in directions no one had thought possible. For the first time, scientists spoke not of delaying death, but of suppressing the virus indefinitely. The news rippled out from Vancouver, and what followed was one of the most dramatic and sudden reversals in the history of medicine. Across the developed world, as doctors began prescribing these new cocktails, the dying stopped dying. People who had been sent home from hospitals to die, people who had wasted away to skeletal frames, their bodies covered in the purple lesions of Kaposi's sarcoma, began to get better. They got up from their deathbeds. The fevers broke, the infections receded. They started to gain weight. Their friends and families, who had been preparing for funerals, watched in stunned disbelief as colour returned to their cheeks. They were coming back to life. It was dubbed the Lazarus effect, and it was no exaggeration. Men who had already sold their apartments and held their own living wakes were suddenly faced with the perplexing, wonderful problem of the future. They had to call their old bosses and ask for their jobs back. They had to unplan their deaths and start planning the rest of their lives. The change was stark, and it was fast. In the United States, between 1996 and 1997, the annual number of AIDS-related deaths fell by 47%. It was the single largest one-year drop in mortality for any major disease in modern history. The wards of St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village, which had been an epicenter of death, began to empty out. AIDS was transformed almost overnight from an acute terminal illness into a chronic, manageable one. It was not a cure. The virus was still there, hiding in reservoirs deep within the body. A sleeping dragon that would reawaken the moment the drugs were stopped. And the treatment was a brutal bargain. The early heart regimens were a demanding, punishing ordeal. Patients had to swallow 20, 30, even 40 pills a day on a rigid schedule that ruled their lives. Some had to be taken with fatty meals, others on an empty stomach. Missing even a handful of doses could allow the virus to roar back, this time with resistance to the very drugs that had saved you. The side effects were severe and sometimes disfiguring. Nausea, diarrhea, and a strange, cruel metabolic syndrome called lipodystrophy that caused fat to vanish from the face and limbs and accumulate in the gut and on the back of the neck. It was a difficult peace, a chemical truce maintained at great cost. And it was a costly peace in another sense too. The price tag for a year of these life-saving medications was between $10,000 and $15,000. In the wealthy nations of North America and Western Europe, a patchwork of private insurance and public healthcare systems meant that most, though not all, who needed the drugs could get them. For those with access, the plague years were ending. A new era had begun. But while champagne corks popped in Western clinics and families celebrated astonishing resurrections, the world was quietly cleaving in two. The miracle of Vancouver was a local one. For the vast majority of the planet's infected, it was a story from a distant land, a rumor of a cure they would never see. While one fire was being dampened in the global north, a far larger conflagration was raging almost unchecked across the plains and cities of sub-Saharan Africa. Here, the virus had arrived quietly in the late 70s and early 1980s, spreading silently along truck routes and through burgeoning urban centers, passed through heterosexual contact in a population already burdened by other endemic diseases. For more than a decade, the scale of the catastrophe had been building, largely invisible to a world preoccupied with the crisis in its own gay communities. By the time HAART was announced, Africa was home to nearly 2/3 of the world's HIV-positive people, and the epidemic was entering its most apocalyptic phase. The numbers were so large they became abstract, losing their human meaning. In countries like Botswana, Swaziland, and Zimbabwe, adult HIV prevalence rates soared past 20%, then 25%, then in some regions, 30%. 1 in every 3 adults was carrying the virus. Life expectancy, which had been steadily climbing for decades, went into a terrifying reverse. In Botswana, it plummeted from over 60 years in the late 1980s to below 40 years by the early 2000s, erasing half a century of public health progress. It was a demographic collapse on a scale not seen since the Black Death. Entire generations were being hollowed out. It was the teachers, the nurses, the farmers, the civil servants, the very people a developing society relies upon, who were dying in their productive prime. This created a nightmarish feedback loop. As healthcare workers died, the clinics and hospitals weakened, making it even harder to fight the disease that was killing them. The most heartbreaking legacy was the orphans. With so many young parents dying, millions of children were left behind, often in the care of elderly grandparents who were themselves struggling, or left to fend for themselves in child-headed households. The continent was grieving on an unimaginable scale. The response was crippled by a perfect storm of obstacles. Poverty was the bedrock of the crisis. Nations with a per capita GDP of a few $100s could not even contemplate spending $10,000 per year on a single patient. There was no infrastructure. Many places lacked not only the clinics and doctors, but the basic roads to transport supplies, the electricity to run refrigerators for storing medicines, and the clean water to swallow them with. Stigma remained a powerful and paralyzing force, driving the sick into the shadows and making prevention efforts impossibly difficult. And in some quarters, there was a catastrophic failure of political leadership. In South Africa, the country with the largest number of infected people in the world, President Thabo Mbeki, who succeeded Nelson Mandela, fell under the spell of a small group of fringe scientists who denied the causal link between HIV and AIDS. He publicly questioned the toxicity of the new drugs and promoted ineffective remedies like garlic and lemon juice. His health minister spoke of beetroot as a frontline defense. This official denialism, at the absolute peak of the country's epidemic, squandered precious years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives, a tragedy of breathtaking proportions. And the fire was not confined to Africa. In Eastern Europe and the republics of the former Soviet Union, the social and economic chaos that followed the collapse of communism created a fertile ground for the virus. Public health systems disintegrated, unemployment and hopelessness skyrocketed, and into this vacuum came a massive surge in intravenous drug use, particularly heroin trafficked from Afghanistan. Sharing needles became the primary route of transmission, and the virus ripped through communities of young people with terrifying speed. In cities across Russia and Ukraine, HIV prevalence among injecting drug users shot from near zero to over 70% in just a few years. It was a concentrated, explosive epidemic, a public health emergency unfolding amidst the ruins of a fallen empire. In Asia, the pandemic wore many different faces. In Thailand, an early and aggressive 100% condom program in the commercial sex industry had achieved remarkable success in curbing the heterosexual spread that was devastating Africa. But in neighboring Cambodia and Myanmar, ravaged by decades of war and poverty, the virus spread rapidly. In the vast populations of India and China, even a low overall prevalence rate translated into millions of infections. India, with its complex tapestry of cultures and social norms, faced a multifaceted epidemic driven by sex work in some regions, migrant labor patterns in others, and drug use along its northeastern borders. The sheer logistical challenge of reaching, testing, and treating people across such a massive and diverse continent was staggering. So, as the West celebrated the end of the plague, the rest of the world was living through its darkest hours. A great wall had been erected. On one side was life, sustained by a complex and expensive pharmacy. On the other side was death, swift and certain. The defining struggle of the next decade would be the fight to tear down that wall. The battle for global access to medicine began not in the halls of government, but on the streets, led by a new generation of activists who understood that the science of Vancouver was meaningless without the politics of distribution. They saw the grotesque injustice of a world where your postal code determined whether you lived or died. The fight was a direct confrontation with the pharmaceutical industry and the global economic rules it had helped to write. At the heart of the conflict was the concept of the patent. Drug companies argued, not without reason, that the enormous cost of researching and developing new medicines, a process that is long, risky, and full of failures, required a period of market exclusivity to recoup the investment and fund future innovation. This protection was enshrined in international law, most notably the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement, which mandated that all member nations, rich or poor, adhere to strict intellectual property laws. For the companies, this was a matter of business and scientific progress. For the activists, it was a death warrant for millions. The International AIDS Conference in Durban, South Africa, in the year 2000, became the flashpoint for this global struggle. Holding the conference in the heart of the pandemic's epicenter was a hugely symbolic act. For the first time, thousands of scientists, doctors, and policymakers from the wealthy North came face to face with the raw, unfiltered reality of the African epidemic. They could no longer ignore the disconnect between the sophisticated discussions in the conference center and the overflowing cemeteries just a few miles away. The conference was dominated by protest. South African activists from the Treatment Action Campaign, TAC, were everywhere, their iconic T-shirts emblazoned with the words HIV positive, a bold defiance of stigma and a demand for life. Led by the charismatic and morally resolute Zaki Ahmat, TAC employed tactics of civil disobedience learned from the anti-apartheid struggle. Ahmat himself, who was HIV positive, famously refused to take antiretroviral drugs until they were made available to all South Africans through the public health system. His life became a ticking clock, a powerful personal testament to the urgency of their cause. The activists' argument was simple and powerful. In a public health emergency of this magnitude, the right to life superseded the right to a profit. They weren't just protesting, they were offering a solution. They pointed to India. For decades, India's patent laws had allowed its domestic pharmaceutical industry to flourish by reverse engineering patented drugs and producing them at a fraction of the cost. Companies like Cipla had become masters of generic manufacturing. The activist strategy was to break the pharmaceutical monopoly by forcing governments to either issue compulsory licenses, allowing them to produce a patented drug without the patent holder's consent, or to import cheap generics from countries like India, an action permitted under WTO rules in emergencies, but fiercely opposed by the drug lobby. The pharmaceutical industry, seeing its entire business model under threat, fought back hard. It lobbied the US and European governments, who in turn put immense diplomatic and economic pressure on countries like South Africa, Brazil, and Thailand to stop them from challenging patent laws. The climax of this confrontation came in 2001, when 39 of the world's largest drug companies banded together to sue the South African government, then led by Nelson Mandela, to prevent it from passing a law that would allow the importation of cheaper generic medicines. It was a catastrophic public relations blunder. The optics were devastating. A powerful group of Western corporations suing the government of Nelson Mandela to deny its people access to life-saving treatment. Protests erupted at company headquarters and US embassies around the world. The lawsuit became a global symbol of corporate greed. Under the weight of overwhelming public condemnation, the pharmaceutical giants buckled and in humiliating retreat dropped the case. It was a turning point. The moral argument had been won, but the practical problem of price remained. That barrier was shattered by one man, Yusuf Hamid, the chairman of the Indian generic company Cipla. In early 2001, he made a history-altering offer to the international aid organization Doctors Without Borders. He announced that Cipla could produce a 3-in-1 combination pill, combining the 3 main drugs of a heart regimen into a single tablet, and would sell it to poor countries for $1 a day, $350 a year. This single act completely demolished the industry's argument that prices could not be lowered. It proved definitively that the manufacturing cost of the drugs was a tiny fraction of their market price in the West. It was now impossible to argue that treating AIDS in Africa was unaffordable. The question was no longer one of possibility, but of political will. The final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The tide of global opinion had shifted. In 2002, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria was established, a new mechanism to pool money from donor nations and purchase medicine and services for the developing world. But the true game changer came from an unexpected source. In his 2003 State of the Union address, US President George W. Bush, a conservative Republican, announced the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. It was an astonishing commitment, $15 billion over 5 years, dedicated to fighting AIDS in 15 of the hardest-hit countries, most of them in Africa and the Caribbean. It was the largest single public health initiative for a specific disease in human history, motivated by a coalition of evangelical Christian groups who saw the African orphan crisis as a moral calling, and by national security advisors who viewed collapsing states in Africa as a threat. PEPFAR was a massive logistical and financial undertaking. It bypassed slow-moving international bureaucracies and worked directly with local organizations on the ground, building clinics, training healthcare workers, setting up supply chains, and most importantly, purchasing and distributing vast quantities of generic antiretroviral drugs. PEPFAR was transformative. It took the possibility created by Cipla's $1 pill and turned it into a reality on a continental scale. Within a few short years, the grim calculus of the epidemic began to change. For the first time, the number of people in Africa starting treatment each year began to outpace the number of new infections. The lines on the graphs that had shown only death and decline for 2 decades began, slowly, miraculously, to bend in the direction of hope. The Lazarus effect, once a privilege of the rich, was finally going global. The fight was far from over. But the great dying had, at last, been interrupted. The architecture of medicine for most of its history was profoundly simple. It was a cathedral built on a foundation of paternalism. The physician was the high priest, the researcher a cloistered monk, and the patient a supplicant, waiting passively for salvation or judgment to be handed down from on high. Knowledge flowed in one direction only, from the laboratory bench, through the regulator's pen, to the prescription pad, and finally to the patient, who was expected to receive it with gratitude and without question. The Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, was the Vatican of this system, a remote, imposing, and opaque institution in Rockville, Maryland, whose pronouncements were law. Its processes were slow, deliberate, and shrouded in a bureaucratic fog so dense that it could take a decade or more for a promising compound to navigate the labyrinth of clinical trials and emerge as an approved drug. For most diseases, this was merely frustrating. For a plague that measured its progress in months, it was a death sentence. The activists of Activism, having mastered the art of theatrical protest on the streets, now turned their gaze toward this fortress. They understood with a chilling clarity that shouting was not enough. To tear down the walls of the cathedral, you had to learn how to read its blueprints. And so a quiet, astonishing revolution began. Not with a thrown brick, but with the turning of a page. A subgroup formed within ACT UP, the Treatment and Data Committee. It was a study group, a self-taught graduate seminar held in the living rooms of condemned men. They were artists, writers, stockbrokers, and paralegals. They were dying, and they began to read. They devoured the New England Journal of Medicine, sifted through abstracts from obscure infectious disease conferences, and learned the arcane language of pharmacology, virology, and biostatistics. They taught themselves the sacred rites of the double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, the so-called gold standard of medical research that, to them, looked more like a game of Russian roulette. They learned that the trials for AZT, the only approved drug, had been designed with a breathtaking callousness. Patients were given either the drug or a sugar pill, and no one knew which. In a population where T-cells were a currency of survival, this withholding of a potentially life-saving treatment felt like a clinical form of murder. They also learned that these trials were exclusionary by design. They were overwhelmingly populated by white gay men who had not yet had an opportunistic infection. Women were excluded. People of color were underrepresented. Intravenous drug users were nowhere to be seen. The very people who were also dying in droves were considered too complicated, their bodies too messy, to produce the clean data the FDA desired. Armed with this knowledge, their protests evolved. They were no longer just expressions of rage. They were peer-reviewed critiques. On October 11th, 1988, they descended on the FDA headquarters in Maryland. It was called Seize Control of the FDA, and it was a masterpiece of logistical planning and informed dissent. People arrived in buses from across the country. They blockaded the doors, unfurled banners that read, "Silence had death." But they also handed out meticulously researched documents. They didn't just demand faster drug approval. They proposed a new system. They called it the parallel track. The idea was simple, elegant, and humane. While a drug was undergoing its slow, rigorous Phase 2 or Phase 3 trials, any patient who could not qualify for those trials should be allowed to access the drug anyway. It was a compassionate use doctrine on a massive scale. It acknowledged that, for people with no other options, the potential benefit of an experimental drug far outweighed the theoretical risk. They also attacked the sanctity of the placebo. They argued that in a fatal disease with no other effective treatments, comparing a new drug to a sugar pill was unethical. Instead, new drugs should be tested against the existing standard of care or in combination with it. They demanded that trials be expanded to include the full, diverse spectrum of the infected population. They were not just patients anymore. They were consultants. They were collaborators. Dr. Anthony Fauci, then the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, was a primary target of their anger. He was the public face of the government's response, and to many, he was the chief architect of its failure. Chants of "Fire Fauci" echoed at demonstrations. Yet, behind the scenes, a strange and reluctant dialogue began. Fauci, a brilliant scientist and a canny bureaucrat, started to listen. He met with the activists. He read their papers. He saw the logic in their fury. The change was not immediate, but the cracks in the fortress began to appear. The FDA, under immense pressure, eventually established the Parallel Track program, formalizing a pathway for expanded access to experimental drugs. The criteria for clinical trials began to broaden. Researchers who had once viewed patients as mere data points started to see the value in their lived experience. Patient advocates, once unheard, were invited to sit on advisory panels at the NIH and the FDA. They were given a seat at the table where decisions about their own lives were being made. This was the deepest, most enduring legacy of the AIDS crisis. It was a Copernican revolution in medicine. The patient was no longer a passive object orbiting the physician. They were now a source of gravity in their own right, a partner in the process of discovery, capable of shaping the very science that sought to save them. The ground had shifted permanently. The paternalistic cathedral, if not torn down, was now filled with new, insistent voices, and its high priests would never again be able to ignore the prayers and the demands of the congregation. The fight for new treatments had, in the process, created a new kind of patient and a new model for medicine, one that would ripple out to affect the research and treatment of cancer, Alzheimer's, and countless other diseases for decades to come. This new medical landscape, shaped by the urgent demands of the dying, had accelerated the machinery of drug development. The pipeline from laboratory to pharmacy was now faster, more responsive, and more inclusive. And it was this re-engineered system that would, in time, produce a different kind of miracle. Not a cure for those already sick, but a shield for those who were not. The concept was not entirely new. Post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP, had been a standard protocol for years. A healthcare worker pricked by a contaminated needle would immediately begin a 28-day course of antiretrovirals, a biochemical blitz intended to wipe out the virus before it could establish a permanent beachhead in the body. The logic was sound, and it led to a tantalizing question. If the drugs could stop an infection after exposure, could they stop it before exposure ever occurred? The idea was pre-exposure prophylaxis, PrEP, a daily pill that could provide a layer of biomedical armor against HIV. The primary candidate for this role was a drug called Truvada, a combination of two antiretroviral compounds, tenofovir and emtricitabine, manufactured by Gilead Sciences. It was already a cornerstone of combination therapy for people living with HIV, known to be potent and relatively safe. But proving its efficacy as a preventative measure was a monumental logistical and ethical undertaking. You couldn't simply give people a pill and then deliberately expose them to the virus. The proof would have to come from the real world, from a massive, meticulously designed study that could track thousands of at-risk individuals over several years. That study was named IPREX. It began in 2007, a global effort coordinated by researchers at the Gladstone Institutes and the University of California, San Francisco. The scale was immense. It enrolled nearly 2,500 participants, primarily HIV-negative men who have sex with men, and a small number of transgender women, across 6 countries: Peru, Ecuador, South Africa, Brazil, Thailand, and the United States. It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, the very model that activists had once fought against. But here, the ethics were different. The participants were not sick and being denied treatment. They were healthy, and the trial was testing a novel prevention strategy. All participants received a comprehensive package of prevention services, including regular HIV testing, counseling, and free condoms. The only variable was the little blue pill they took each day. Half received Truvada, half received a placebo. For 3 years, the study ran its quiet course. Data was collected, pills were dispensed, blood was drawn. Then, on November 23, 2010, the world changed. The results were announced. The IPREX study demonstrated that, among the men who took their pill consistently, the risk of acquiring HIV was reduced by a staggering 92%. Even when accounting for everyone in the drug arm of the trial, including those who were not adherent to the daily regimen, the overall risk reduction was 44%. It was a breakthrough. The data was unequivocal. For the first time since the condom, there was a powerful biomedical tool that could sever the chain of HIV transmission. The path to widespread use, however, was not smooth. On July 16, 2012, the FDA officially approved Truvada for use as PrEP. Yet the response from some quarters was not celebration, but suspicion. a deep-seated cultural anxiety emerged, an echo of the moral panics of the early 80s. Critics, including some prominent AIDS activists like Michael Weinstein of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, argued that PrEP would lead to a culture of complacency. They feared it would create a generation of men who, feeling invincible, would abandon condoms, leading to a surge in other sexually transmitted infections. The term Truvada whore began to appear on social media and dating apps, a vicious slur aimed at shaming those who chose to use this new form of protection. It was a strange and bitter irony. A community that had fought for 2 decades for medical self-determination now found itself bitterly divided over a pill that offered just that. The debates raged over cost and access. A month's supply of Truvada without insurance cost well over $1,000 in the United States, placing it far out of reach for many of the vulnerable populations who needed it most. Public health departments and community organizations scrambled to create programs to navigate the labyrinth of insurance paperwork and patient assistance programs. There were also concerns about adherence. PrEP only works if you take it, and a daily pill requires a level of consistency that can be challenging. And then there was the spectre of drug resistance, the fear that widespread use of Truvada among HIV-negative people could create resistant strains of the virus if someone on PrEP did become infected, a phenomenon known as a breakthrough infection. Yet, despite the controversies, the tide was turning. As more and more real-world data emerged from cities like San Francisco, London, and Sydney, the evidence became overwhelming. In communities where PrEP uptake was high, new HIV infection rates plummeted, falling to historic lows. The feared explosion of other STIs did occur in some populations, but public health officials framed it not as a failure of PrEP, but as a sign that sexual health needed a more comprehensive approach. PrEP was not a magic bullet, but a powerful new tool in the arsenal. It was most effective when combined with the old tools: regular testing, open communication, and yes, condoms. The conversation slowly shifted from one of moral judgment to one of public health logistics. The challenge was no longer to prove that PrEP worked, but to get it into the hands of everyone who could benefit from it, particularly in communities of color and in the global South, where the epidemic continued to rage with devastating force. The era of prevention had been redefined. The fight was no longer just about behavior. It was about access to a pill that could, quite literally, hold the plague at bay. And still, the horizon beckoned. Prevention was a shield, treatment was a truce, but the ultimate goal remained the same as it had been from the beginning: a cure, an outright eradication of the virus from the body. For decades, this goal felt like a distant, almost mythical destination. The very nature of HIV made it a uniquely formidable opponent. It was a retrovirus, meaning it wrote its genetic code directly into the DNA of its host cells, most notably the CD4 T cells that were supposed to be the generals of the immune army. It turned the body's own defenders into viral factories. Antiretroviral therapy could stop this process, suppressing the virus to undetectable levels and preventing it from causing illness. But it could not eliminate it entirely. The virus was a master of stealth. It would lie dormant, sleeping silently within the DNA of a small number of long-lived cells. This was the latent reservoir, a ghost in the machine. As long as this reservoir existed, stopping treatment would allow the virus to come roaring back to life within weeks. A cure would require not just suppressing the virus, but exorcising this ghost. For a long time, it was unclear if this was even biologically possible. Then came the man known to the world as the Berlin patient. His name was Timothy Ray Brown, an American living in Germany who had been diagnosed with HIV in 1995. A decade later, he was diagnosed with an entirely separate and equally deadly disease: acute myeloid leukemia. His life was hanging by a thread. His German oncologist, Gero Hutter, proposed a radical, incredibly risky course of action. Brown needed a stem cell transplant to treat the leukemia, a procedure that would essentially wipe out his own immune system and replace it with that of a donor. Hutter had a brilliant, audacious idea. What if he could find a stem cell donor who was not only a match for Brown, but who also carried a rare genetic mutation? The mutation, known as CCR5 delta 32, deletes a portion of the gene that codes for the CCR5 co-receptor, the primary doorway that most strains of HIV use to enter T cells. A small percentage of people of Northern European descent are born with this mutation, making them naturally resistant to HIV. Finding such a donor was like searching for a needle in a global haystack, but they found one. In 2007, Brown underwent the grueling procedure. He was blasted with chemotherapy and radiation to destroy his cancerous, HIV-infected immune system. Then the donor's stem cells were infused into his body. The process was brutal. He nearly died, but slowly, miraculously, the new immune system took hold. An immune system built from cells that lacked the doorway for HIV. Brown stopped taking his antiretroviral medication. The doctors waited. The world waited. The virus did not come back. A week passed, a month, a year. The most sensitive tests available could find no trace of replicating HIV anywhere in his body. Timothy Ray Brown was cured. His case, first reported in 2008, sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It was a proof of concept. It was the end of one experiment that proved a cure was possible. The procedure he endured was far too toxic and expensive to ever be a scalable solution for the millions living with HIV. But it provided a roadmap. It showed that if you could somehow eliminate the latent reservoir and prevent new cells from being infected, the body could be cleared of the virus. This single, extraordinary case opened up entire new fields of research, all aimed at replicating the outcome of the Berlin patient through safer, more accessible means. One of the most promising strategies became known as shock and kill. The logic is deceptively simple. The latent reservoir is the main barrier to a cure because the immune system and antiretroviral drugs cannot target cells that are not actively producing the virus. The shock phase involves using drugs called latency-reversing agents to wake up the sleeping virus, forcing the infected cells to start producing viral proteins. This makes them visible to the immune system. The kill phase would then, in theory, rely on the body's own defenses, perhaps boosted by a therapeutic vaccine or other immunotherapies, to recognize and destroy these newly activated cells. It's a strategy of flushing the enemy out of hiding and into an ambush. Dozens of clinical trials have tested this approach, with mixed results. Waking the virus up has proven to be possible. Ensuring that every last awakened cell is destroyed has been far more difficult. Another frontier is gene therapy, inspired directly by Timothy Ray Brown's story. Researchers are using tools like CRISPR-Cas9 to edit the genes of a patient's own immune cells. The idea is to remove a patient's T cells, take them to a lab, use genetic scissors to snip out the CCR5 gene, and then reinfuse these newly edited, HIV-resistant cells back into the body. It is a high-tech, personalized approach to building a resistant immune system from within, without the need for a matched donor or a risky transplant. The research is still in its early stages, a complex and expensive process, but it holds the dream of a one-time treatment that could provide a functional cure, allowing a person to live without daily medication. And then there is the oldest and most elusive prize of all, a vaccine, a shot that could prevent infection in the first place. The search for an HIV vaccine has been a story of frustration and failure for nearly 40 years. The virus's astonishing ability to mutate, to constantly change its outer coat, has allowed it to evade every vaccine candidate thrown at it. It is a moving target like no other pathogen known to science. But even here, there is progress. Scientists have discovered that a small number of people living with HIV naturally produce remarkable antibodies called broadly neutralizing antibodies that can recognize and attack a wide range of HIV strains. The current goal is to reverse engineer a vaccine that can teach anyone's immune system how to make these super antibodies, providing a durable shield against the virus. Decades have passed since the first cryptic reports of a strange pneumonia in Los Angeles. The plague that defined the late 20th century has not vanished. It persists. More than 35 million people have died. Nearly 40 million more are living with the virus today. The scientific triumphs, from combination therapy to PrEP, have not been distributed equally. In the wealthy cities of the global north, HIV has largely become a manageable chronic condition. But in the villages of sub-Saharan Africa, in the marginalized communities of Eastern Europe and the American South, the crisis continues, fueled by poverty, stigma, and a lack of access to the very tools that have saved so many elsewhere. The search for a cure continues. In the quiet hum of laboratory freezers and the whir of centrifuges, in the dedicated work of thousands of researchers around the globe. It is a slow, methodical, incremental process, a world away from the frantic desperation of the early years. But the lessons of those years endure. They live in the patient advocates who now sit on regulatory panels, in the accelerated pathways for drug approval, in the global networks of activists who demand access to medicine for all. The fight against AIDS did more than just change medicine. It revealed the terrifying speed at which a new virus can circle the globe, the devastating cost of ignorance and prejudice, and the extraordinary power of a community that, when faced with extinction, chose to fight back with rage, with love, and with science. The final chapter of this plague has yet to be written, but the story of how humanity faced it, how it was changed by it, and how it continues to fight it, is a testament not just to the fragility of life, but to its resilience, to its stubborn, enduring, and ultimately hopeful refusal to be silenced.